Welcome to Kat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm Kat, and this is Kat Has Questions. Okay, guys, today's episode is kind of like a longie but a goodie. Are we allowed to say that? But I promise, twists and turns all the way. This is part 3 of our Dead Wrong series on the Pam Hupp case. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, definitely start there because the story is about to get weird. And I know you're thinking, this sounds pretty straightforward, but I'm telling you, it is not. In episode 1 and 2, we talked about the night Betsy Faria was killed and how Pam Hupp became the most trusted voice in the room. Today, we're talking about what happens when that trust becomes evidence. And today, things will take a turn again. Let's get into it. Part 3, The Man They Said Did It. When police arrested Russ Faria for his wife's murder, it didn't feel controversial. There was no public outcry, no collective confusion, no sense that something didn't add up. It felt like resolution, a violent crime, a clear narrative, a suspect who made sense. By the time the handcuffs were on, the story had already felt finished. By this point, investigators had already committed to a working theory of the crime, one that would later shape every decision and courtroom argument. So, the way they built the case against Russ, it was not built around a single undeniable piece of evidence. There was no murder weapon conclusively tied to him, no eyewitness who saw the crime happen, no forensic detail that independently proved his guilt. Investigators did recover knives from the home, but none could be definitively identified as the murder weapon through forensic testing. So what that really means is there wasn't really evidence that was tying him to this case. What the state had instead was a framework, a timeline, a motive, a story that explained the violence in a way that people recognized. This kind of case is called circumstantial, and that word gets misunderstood. Circumstantial doesn't automatically mean it's weak, but it means it's interpretive. It requires you to decide what things mean. There's no actual physical evidence and facts to tell you what is true or what isn't. Russ was Betsy's husband. He found her body and there was no forced entry. In criminal trials, these facts are not presented in isolation. They are offered together, allowing jurors to infer intent, opportunity, and responsibility without direct eyewitness accounts. Those facts don't prove guilt on their own, but placed inside the right story, they didn't need to. So as we talked about a lot in the last episode, the prosecutor's case centered on a familiar narrative. A troubled marriage, a woman who was afraid, and a private argument that escalated into violence. The number of stab wounds, 55, was framed as rage, overkill, a loss of control. In court, prosecutors often rely on overkill arguments to suggest an emotional motive rather than calculated action, especially in domestic homicide cases. And at the center of that story was Pam Hupp. Pam's testimony gave the crime emotional logic. She told the jury that Betsy was scared, that she had confided in her, and that she was planning to leave him. These statements were presented as insight into Betsy's state of mind, despite the fact that they were not corroborated by independent witnesses or written records. So no one else said that Betsy had said these things. Pam also described her own movements on the night Betsy was killed. She testified that she picked Betsy up after the trivia fundraiser and drove her home. She said the drive was uneventful, that Betsy went inside her house, and that she watched Betsy enter safely before leaving. This version of events was consistent across interviews and testimony. It didn't change, it didn't waver, and that consistency mattered because in court, consistency is often treated as a credible witness. They didn't just suggest motive, they kind of completed it. Once jurors believed that Betsy feared her husband, everything else clicked into place. The violence had a reason, the timing had a reason, and the lack of forced entry had a reason. The story really just explains itself. But I want to do an evidence-based breakdown here of the kind of forensic and non-forensic evidence from her murder case, including what was found at the scene, what was used against Russ, and what meaningful evidence involving other people, someone pretty close to the case, that was ignored or excluded during the original investigation and trial. So as we talked about, a quick recap, it's December 27th, 2011. Betsy's dropped off by Pam. She's brutally murdered sometime after that. And then Russ arrives home at 9:40 and finds her on the living room floor. Early police focus narrowed in on Russ almost immediately because he found her, because he's the husband, and Pam gave a story about Russ's personality and kind of an insight to their marriage. So in November 2013, about 2 years later, Russ is tried for first-degree murder. It's easy to see where the investigation may have gone wrong. But in hindsight, they had early tunnel vision. Once Russ was identified as the guy, evidence was filtered through that lens to support the theory. Clearly, as I've been describing to you, and hopefully you're catching on to, their over-reliance on Pam Hupp. Police treated her as a helpful witness instead of a suspect. There was some forensic misinterpretation. There was very minimal physical evidence tying Russ to the murder. No forensic proof that he committed the stabbing. And then there was exclusion of critical context, like a financial motive, cell phone data, and pattern behavior, which we made obvious later in the story. So this case now, in hindsight, is widely cited as an example of confirmation bias, a failure to investigate alternative suspects, overvaluing behavior and testimony over physical evidence, and the danger of a convincing but deceptive witness. So, some forensic and physical evidence found at the scene. There was blood in their house, so on bedroom light switches, on a pair of Russ's slippers found in a closet, but it almost looked like the slippers were dipped in blood. There was no large blood trails, no bloody towels, or sign of cleaning up after, suggesting that whoever committed the crime did not move extensively through the blood after the murder occurred. There was no blood on Russ at all. Swabs of Russ's clothing, hands, and feet did not contain Betsy's blood, indicating he had no physical contact consistent with stabbing her. So there was no bloody prints, DNA, or other trace evidence placing Russ at the murder act itself. So also something to kind of keep in mind was the time of death. Because the medical examiner determined Betsy had been dead for hours before Russ arrived, the blood was already drying, so it was drying by the time Russ had gotten to her. The approximate window of death was estimated to be before Russ could even be there. And as you remember, they had receipts, surveillance footage of his alibi. So that couldn't be disputed of maybe he arrived home earlier. No, we know when he got home. And the blood, like I said, was dry when he got there. So some non-forensic evidence that they used in the case. Russ did have a very strong alibi. He was with 4 friends at a gathering before the murder. Cell phone records, indicating where he was. He was getting gas and fast food receipts. Surveillance footage at the locations he was saying he was at made it physically impossible for him to commit this murder. The police and the prosecution cited the way Russ spoke on the 911 call as a reason to suspect him, including alternating between calm and hysteria, though there's no scientific reliability as to how you should act. Also, there was a document which was believed to be a letter written by Betsy found on Betsy's laptop, suggesting she feared Russ might hurt her. So, in court, Russ's trial in 2013, prosecutors focused on the suspicious blood on his slippers and the light switch, the claim via Hupp that he had a violent temper, so she's kind of the only one who ever said that, the fact that he was the husband and he was present, and that he failed a polygraph test when asked if he committed the murder. As we know, though, polygraph tests are not accurate. Just so you know, you should not do a polygraph if you are ever convicted of a murder because they're not accurate. Despite very strong alibi evidence, the prosecution argued friends could have been helping him fabricate the timeline. The judge at the time also, this is a huge part, did not allow the defense to present evidence implicating Pam as an alternative suspect or any other alternative suspect for that matter, which is kind of a big deal because she was the last person to see him alive. The defense faced a fundamental problem. They didn't just have to poke holes in evidence, they had to disrupt a narrative that already felt whole. In circumstantial cases, the defense is often placed in a reactive position, challenging interpretations rather than presenting a competing explanation. Jurors basically weren't choosing between 2 competing stories, they were choosing between one story and uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for all of us. As the case progressed, Pam's testimony went beyond describing Betsy's fear. She made an assertion that further narrowed the narrative. She even kind of started changing her story and later testified that Russ was the driver in a scenario that described involving an intruder. So like she kind of, not that she was changing her story, but kind of. And it just kind of like narrowed in on making him more obviously guilty. But this thing that she came up with, there's no physical evidence of it. There's no eyewitness, no surveillance footage, no forensic confirmation. The absence of evidence didn't feel innocent. It felt like something was missing from a completed picture. When the jury reached a verdict, it was decisive. Guilty. Russ Faria was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict reflected not just acceptance of their theory, but confidence in it. There was no hung jurors, no reported hesitation. For the court, the case was closed. For the public, it was settled. For Russ, it was everything. It was his life. After the verdict, attention moved on. There was no major protests, no urgent calls for review. Pam just remained a credible witness. Her role in the case went largely unquestioned. Her story had worked. And once a verdict is reached, doubt becomes inconvenient. Revisiting the case would mean reopening wounds, admitting mistakes. So the case stayed closed, at least on paper. Russ would spend nearly 4 years in prison for a crime the state said he committed. But there are a few key details, quiet, unexamined, and easy to overlook, that didn't fit the story everyone believed. But once it surfaced, it made ignoring the rest of the case impossible. So this is where the case takes another turn, and guys, it's a big one. Why would someone murder their spouse when the spouse was already dying? Not hypothetically, not eventually, already. It's a simple question, the kind that should stop a case in its tracks. But in this one, no one was asking. At the time of Russ Faria's arrest and trial, this question was not central to the prosecution's theory of the crime, nor was it meaningfully explored by the jury. So motive is a huge part, obviously, in a criminal investigation and a criminal case for why somebody committed a crime that they committed. This detail was never meaningfully wrestled with for the jury. Betsy Faria was sick. She had cancer. Medical records confirm that Betsy had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer prior to her death. This was not a new diagnosis. It wasn't like some sudden downturn. Betsy had been undergoing treatment and her prognosis was poor. Physicians had informed Betsy and those close to her that her cancer was terminal with limited life expectancy despite treatment. She was not expected to live much longer. And that fact changes everything because urgency depends on time. If someone stood to gain financially from Betsy's death, waiting would have achieved the same outcome. There was no ticking clock for Russ, no reason to act violently, no reason to risk everything. This reality directly undercuts the prosecution's theory of this spontaneous, rage-driven act motivated by impending loss or desperation. Because desperation makes no sense when time is already doing the work for you. As horrible as it sounds, if Russ wanted money or he was worried about losing her, Betsy was likely going to die soon rather than later anyways because of her stage 4 cancer diagnosis. Another detail I learned about Pam is that according to multiple long-form reports, Pam and Betsy lost touch for a time. So if you remember, they kind of became friends in the early 2000s and they reconnected more closely after Betsy was diagnosed with cancer in 2010. And if you remember, she died in 2011. So during that period, Pam became a frequent companion of Betsy, driving her to appointments and spending significant time with her as her illness progressed. And guys, if that fact alone doesn't shock you or make you question everything, there's more. I've always got more in this story. After Betsy's death, details about her life insurance policy came into focus. This was information either unknown or at least not focused on during the investigation and trial. So it really kind of came out and was questioned afterwards. Betsy had a substantial life insurance policy. Shortly before her death, the beneficiary was changed. Not to her husband, not to her kids, but to her friend, Pam Hupp. Court records later confirmed that Pam Hupp was named the primary beneficiary on Betsy Faria's life insurance policy. A change made very shortly before Betsy's death. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It wasn't a token amount. The payout would ultimately total approximately $150,000. And as I mentioned, the change didn't happen years earlier or like during a distant chapter of Betsy's life. It happened right before her death. And Pam was such a good friend and helped her facilitate the paperwork. So let's kind of dive into this policy a little bit. This policy of $150,000 was already in place before 2011, but on December 23rd, 2011, Betsy executed a change of beneficiary designation form. And if you remember, so I said December 23rd, Betsy was murdered on December 27th, so 4 days later. On the form, she changed the primary beneficiary from her husband, Russ, to Pam. Importantly, she did not name any contingent beneficiaries, meaning if Pam died or could not collect it for some reason, there was no alternative person listed. So usually on these insurance policies, you list your primary and then contingent. So maybe your spouse and then your kids. If your spouse were to also die, then your kids get the money. The form did not include any restrictions or instructions limiting what Pam could do with the proceeds. So how did this go down? Because my first thought was, did maybe Pam forge the signature somehow? But Betsy and Pam went to a public library, St. Charles City County Public Library, on December 11th, 2011, where a library employee named Lauren Manganelli witnessed Betsy sign this form, and Pam was present during the time. The library employee testified that Betsy appeared to be physically weak, which would make sense if she was battling cancer, but she was alert, responsive, and able to sign her name. There was no evidence that Pam forged Betsy's signature or submitted the form without Betsy being there. So from a legal standpoint, this signature itself is considered valid. A different witness later testified that she recalled Betsy saying she was removing her husband as a beneficiary so her daughters could benefit, although memories kind of varied as time passed. Another family friend said Betsy spoke about the policy with Pam around at the same time, and that Betsy was concerned her children would be taken care of. Her children were adults, by the way, at this point. So with typical insurance practices, the beneficiary change takes effect on the day that the form is signed. So meaning that it became effective as soon as Betsy signed that form. There's no public record showing any dispute that the change was in fact recorded and became effective that day. So the understanding is that Betsy wanted Pam to keep this money safe and give it to her children. That wasn't written in the beneficiary form, but that was the understood agreement from witnesses. After Betsy's death, Pam did not immediately pay any of the proceeds to Betsy's children, which became a central issue in a separate civil lawsuit by the daughters alleging fraud and unjust enrichment. So, as I mentioned, I was kind of well, how do we know Pam didn't do this? But there was a witness, and while Pam didn't secretly file it alone, she was actively involved in the process. Many investigators, journalists, and observers believe Betsy was manipulated or pressured. Betsy was terminally ill and emotionally vulnerable, and she was quite dependent on Pam at this point for rides and help and support. Betsy really did think she was a close friend of hers. Pam had positioned herself as Betsy's protector. So, maybe you've already inferred this on your own, but this kind of makes things seem a little suspicious. The timing, the change happened 4 days before she was murdered, and Betsy never told her husband or daughters about this change. The structure of the policy, so as I mentioned, Pam was the sole beneficiary, no conditions, no trust, no children listed. And that setup overwhelmingly benefits one person, Pam Hupp. Pam later did not promptly give the money to Betsy's daughters. She later claimed, so initially she's oh, yep, the daughters want it, it's for the daughters. But she later claimed Betsy wanted her to have it, and then claimed it was meant for the girls, and then resisted turning it over. So she was changing her story about this money. At the time of Russ Faria's trial, this information existed, but it was minimized. It just kind of got brushed over. But after Betsy's death, it became the subject of a legal dispute. Betsy's daughters filed a civil lawsuit challenging the distribution of the insurance proceeds. The lawsuit was not about emotion or suspicion. It was about ownership and entitlement. Who had the legal right to the money? And whether the beneficiary change reflected Betsy's true intent. This lawsuit unfolded quietly and separate from the criminal trial, but it mattered because it showed the insurance decision didn't end with Betsy's death. It created ripple effects, financial, legal, and relational, that extended well beyond the crime scene. So the daughters sued Pam, and the court did acknowledge it was suspicious circumstances, but civil cases hinge on proof, and those are hard to meet in this case. The case ultimately did not definitively rule Pam committed fraud, but it did highlight how unusual and troubling the arrangement was. But if money was a motive for Russ, Why wasn't the money going to Russ? So once you put these two details side by side, the insurance policy and the cancer diagnosis, the motive that anchored the entire case kind of begins to unravel. The idea that Russ needed Betsy gone doesn't hold. The idea that he was racing against something doesn't hold. The urgency disappears. If she was going to leave him, unfortunately, she was going to die anyways, so she would be leaving one way or another. When the urgency disappears, the violence no longer fits the narrative, and the question shifts. Not to how the crime happened, but to why this explanation ever worked at all. Because if Russ didn't benefit financially and didn't need to act quickly, and wasn't facing a future that required violence, then the story the jury was given collapses under its own weight. I also want to circle back, so there's one more thing. I mentioned earlier that there was a letter found on a computer on Betsy's laptop presented to be written by Betsy. This letter described the fear of her husband. It reinforced the prosecution's emotional framework. But later, when this was analyzed, it indicated that the document could not have been created by her computer because it was done in a Word format, so like Microsoft Word, which was not supported on her laptop, implying that it was planted or fabricated. If true, that letter wasn't evidence of fear. It was a mechanism of manufacturing it. Not discovered emotion, but constructed context. So, in post-conviction analysis, this is the moment where motive ceases to support the verdict, and it starts raising a lot of questions. So, I'm going to kind of walk through some evidence that points Pam Hupp, but was ignored or suppressed. So, the biggie, the life insurance policy, $150,000 that was going to go to her days before she died. Another thing that was really suppressed was Pam's cell phone records. Her phone records place Pam near Betsy's home for about 30 minutes after she claimed to have dropped Betsy off, contradicting her stated timeline, and also like right in that time frame of when Betsy would have died. Pam had a lot of inconsistent statements kind of over the course of the years. So she initially claimed she didn't enter their home when dropping Betsy off, but then she later changed her story, which was raising suspicion. Hupp made disparaging comments about Russ to investigators, suggesting domestic abuse that wasn't supported by any physical evidence. And Pam also did not have an alibi. Russ did. There's also some scene staging theories alleged by prosecutors in 2021, so much later, alleging that Hupp dipped Betsy's socks in her own blood and then placed them on Betsy to stage the scene as a domestic homicide. And also that Russ's slippers were dipped in blood too. And then finally, there was suppression of exculpatory evidence, meaning that official filings in Russ's lawsuit claim that police and prosecutors suppressed or refused to consider evidence that would have pointed to Hupp. So they would not let the defense use Hupp as an alternative suspect theory. They basically just didn't even look into evidence that could point to Hupp's guilt. There's a lot of evidence that was ignored, a lot of evidence that kind of was just looked through the lens of Russ being guilty and not even considering Pam. But as we see now, that was a big mistake. But systems don't like reversal. Once a conviction is secured, revisiting motive feels destabilizing. And it raises questions no one wants to answer about tunnel vision, about early assumptions. And legally overturning a conviction requires more than doubt. It requires new evidence, procedural errors, or proof that material information was improperly excluded. So instead of reopening the case, the system held its ground. The conviction stood. Russ remained in prison for 4 years. And as I mentioned, they did not let them talk about Pam being an alternative suspect, meaning the evidence about the life insurance policy, Pam's cell phone location, her inconsistent statements, or Pam's motive or opportunity were not allowed to be discussed. The jury only heard one story, and that was that the husband did it. In April 2015, the Missouri Court of Appeals overturned Russ's conviction and ordered a new trial. The court said in plain terms, the jury should have been allowed to hear evidence implicating Pam, excluding that evidence was not harmless error, and that the trial was fundamentally unfair without it. So this appeal is huge for Russ. Courts do not overturn murder convictions lightly. So Russ had a second trial in 2015, where the jury finally heard about the life insurance and all the sus information with Pam included. Once jurors were allowed to see the full picture, the case collapsed. Russ was acquitted after just a few hours of deliberation. That speed tells you how weak the case against him really was. Now, I want to point out that people were suspicious of Pam, but it wasn't like after his case was acquitted, it was like immediately, oh, we're charging her. But when motive collapses, the focus begins to shift, quietly at first, from the husband who didn't benefit at all to the person who did. From a story built on belief to one built on opportunity. Because once you ask the right question, the wrong story cannot survive. Now, you might think once again, wait, this case is closed. We know what's going on. Nothing else crazy could happen in these people's lives, right? Now, would you believe me if I said there could be more twists in this case? That Pam could potentially be connected to another crime? Next time on Kat Has Questions, Part 4, Another Death. Sources for this episode are listed in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.